Well, I'm very grateful and honoured to initiative inviting me this evening to come and speak to you. So, Your Excellency, fathers, sisters, ladies and gentlemen. The lecture this evening will be in two parts. In the first part, I want to speak about Newman on conscience in relation to the existence of God. And then in the second part of the lecture, I shall speak on Newman on conscience in relation to authority. So I begin with Newman on conscience and the existence of God. In a study I published a few years ago called, with an echo, of course, of Newman, called The Grammar of Consent, the English Dominican theologian Aidan Nichols criticized Newman for concentrating his energies exclusively on one aspect of our experience, our awareness of moral obligation, for a unilateral concentration on moral experience, that is, our experience of conscience. Presumably there could be no objection to Newman placing the major emphasis on conscience, since in doing so he would only be reflecting the whole thrust of the Bible and the Christian tradition, summed up in the words of St. Paul on the law of God, that is engraved on the hearts of human beings, enlightened by conscience, if not by revelation. But how far is it true that Newman confines himself to the moral argument for God's existence? It is certainly true that in his essay in aid of a grammar of assent, published in 1870, Newman calls conscience the great, though not the sole, internal teacher of religion. It is the great teacher since it is a personal guide, and I use it because I must use myself. And since it is nearer to me than any other means of knowledge. In other words, what is so important about conscience for Newman is that it is both personal to the individual and a form of knowledge that is accessible to others through their consciences. As then conscience is both experiential and cognitive, it has a special philosophical importance for effective apologetics. And Newman says that if he had to prove the being of God, this is where he would look for the proof of it. He argues that just as we become aware of the physical world through our senses, so from the perceptive power which identifies the intimations of conscience with the reverberations or echoes, so to say, of an external admonition, we proceed on to the notion of a supreme ruler and judge. And then again, we image him and his attributes in those recurring intimations out of which, as mental phenomena, our recognition of his existence was originally gained. Giving to conscience its ordinary and primary meaning of a sense of duty or a magisterial dictate rather than merely a moral sense, Newman explains that conscience does not repose on itself, but vaguely reaches forward to something beyond self and dimly discerns a sanction higher than self for its decisions. And hence it is that we are accustomed to speak of conscience as a voice, and moreover voice or the echo of a voice. Newman, of course, hastily corrects himself, the modifiers, we said echo, because of course we may hear it wrongly, or the echo of a voice, imperative and constraining, like no other dictate in the whole of our experience. Conscience, Newman continues, always involves the recognition of a living object towards which it is directed. Inanimate things cannot stir our affections. These are correlative with persons. If, as is the case, we feel responsibility, are ashamed, are frightened at transgressing the voice of conscience, this implies that there is one to whom we are responsible, before whom we are ashamed, whose claims upon us we fear. If the cause of those emotions does not belong to this visible world, the object to which our perception is directed must be supernatural and divine. And thus the phenomena of conscience as a dictate avail to impress the imagination with the picture of a supreme governor, a judge holy, just, powerful, all-seeing, retributive, and is the creative principle of religion, as the moral sense is the principle of ethics. It has been remarked that Newman here does not argue to a law of binding force, and from thence, in the old style, to a lawgiver. He himself denied that he was trying to employ an abstract argument from the force of the terms, such as that a law implies a lawgiver, but that he was responding to the peculiarity of that feeling to which we give the name of conscience. His earlier writings, however, do give some credence to the idea, as when he preached that a law implies a lawgiver and a command implies a superior. But this quotation from a fairly early sermon is followed by the words, "Thus a man is at once thrown out of himself by the very voice which speaks within him." By the time Newman came to write his novel Callista as a Catholic in 1856, the argument has become completely personalized. It is the echo of a person speaking to me. Nothing shall persuade me that it does not ultimately proceed from a person external to me. It carries with it its power of its divine origin. My nature feels towards it as towards a person. An echo implies a voice a speaker. That speaker I love and I fear. Conscience frees a person from the narrowness of self by opening up into personal communion with the person of God. Its very existence throws us out of ourselves and beyond ourselves to go and seek for him in the height and depth whose voice it is. In the last great chapter of his theological autobiography, The Apologia Pro Vita Sua, where Newman offers a general defense of Catholicism, he says, "Were it not for this voice speaking so clearly in my conscience and my heart, I should be an atheist or a pantheist or a polytheist when I looked into the world." This reference to the heart as well as the conscience suggests that Newman did not confine an experiential awareness of God to the moral life. It seems rather to be the case that he regarded the argument from conscience as the most effective philosophical argument. Not that he did not also think that there were other compelling reasons for believing in God's existence apart from the traditional proofs and evidences. And this is shown very vividly in his novel, his second novel, Callista, where the pagan heroine, after whom the book is called, is deeply impressed by the fact that the different Christians she meets all make Christianity consist in the intimate presence in the heart. It was the friendship, it seemed to her, or mutual love of person with person. Here was the very teaching which was already so urgently demanded both by her reason and her heart, which she found nowhere else, which she found existing one and the same in a female slave, in a country youth, in a learned priest. In other words, what really draws the Greek pagan heroine Callista to the Christian faith is not primarily her awareness of conscience, but of the deepest need of the human heart, which cannot ultimately be satisfied by another person, but only by the person of God. Indeed, what makes Callista receptive to hearing the gospel in the first place is not a guilty conscience, but a profound sense of personal unfulfillment. Here am I, a living, breathing woman with an overflowing heart, with keen affections, with a yearning after some object which may possess me. I cannot exist without something to rest upon. I cannot fall back upon that drear, forlorn state which philosophers call wisdom and moralists call virtue. I must have something to love. Love is my life. In answer to her objection to the doctrine of hell, Cecilius, who of course is meant to be Saint Cyprian, the priest in the novel, shows that far from the dogma being an obstacle to faith, it is actually involved in Callista's own existential understanding. This, of course, is hardly an argument I think that Saint Cyprian would have used, but it's a very Newmanian argument. For if there's life after death, Cecilius says, then you will still be you. You will still be the same being, but deprived of those outward stays and solaces which, such as they are, you now enjoy. You will be yourself, shut up in yourself. I have heard that people go mad at length when placed in solitary confinement. If then on passing hence you are cut off from what you had here, and if only the company of yourself, I think your burden will be so far greater, not less, than it is now. Assuming then first that the soul always needs external objects to rest upon, next that it has no prospect of any such when it leaves this visible scene, and thirdly, the hunger and thirst, the gnawing of the heart where it occurs, is as keen and piercing as a flame, it will follow there is nothing irrational in the notion of an eternal Tartarus. It's very, very similar to what the English novelist William Golding said not long before he died when he was asked if he believed in the afterlife, and he said, "Oh no, I couldn't bear to be myself forever." But if, on the other hand, Cecilius argues on exactly the same existential lines as Callista, all your thoughts go one way. If you have needs, desires, aims, aspirations, all of which demand an object, and imply by their very existence that such an object does exist also, and if nothing here does satisfy them, and if there be a message which professes to come from that object, of whom you already have the presentiment, and to teach you about him, and to bring the remedy you crave, and if those who try that remedy say with one voice that the remedy's answers, are you not bound, Callista, at least to look up that way, to inquire in what you hear about it, and to ask for his help, if he be, to enable you to believe in him? The argument from conscience, already quoted, only appears towards the end of the novel, just prior to Callista's conversion. And here too is a part, albeit a major part, of a more general awareness of the person she was seeking for. Here was that to which her intellect tended, though that intellect could not frame it. It could approve and acknowledge when set before it what it could not originate. Here was he who spoke to her in her conscience, whose voice she heard. Without this person, life on earth is portrayed by Newman as a kind of living hell for anyone who has, like Callista, the capacity both to love to the full and to be aware of that need. The hellish fate for the heart deprived of the supreme object of love is in effect Newman's definition of hell. You cannot escape from yourself. And so Callista is drawn to the Christian God, not just because of the voice echoing in her conscience, but because the more she thought over what she heard of Christianity, the more she was drawn to it, and the more it approved itself to her whole soul, and the more it seemed to respond to all her needs and aspirations. Aidan Nichols is disappointed by the grammar of assent, since he writes, having held out to us the appropriate form for an argument to God's existence, a form at once rational and imaginative, Newman's content seems thin gruel in comparison. For while conceding that the moral argument for the existence of God is not dead, Nichols rejects the notion that moral experience alone can provide a basis for belief in God. As I've already tried to show, there are three answers to this criticism. First, Newman does not restrict the relevant human experience for theistic belief to moral experience. Second, he does, however, regard, like Kant, the moral argument as the best philosophical argument. Third, it is a well-known fact that the human sense of sin, that is the human sense of sin which is the most universal ground, in fact, for religion. It is precisely this feeling of guilt that Newman says in the last chapter of the Grammar of Assent is the basis of natural religion, which is founded in one way or other on the sense of sin. And without that vivid sense, it would hardly have any precepts or any observances. The fact that God appears to be so strikingly absent from his world is another very good reason why Newman stresses the moral argument. I see only a choice of alternatives in explanation of so critical a fact. Either there is no creator, or he has disowned his creatures. Of course, these are very bold words in the context of the 19th century Catholic Church, where the standard proofs for God's existence, of course, were taught as practically a de fide. Are then the dim shadows of his presence in the affairs of men but a fancy of our own? Or on the other hand, has he hid his face in the light of his countenance, because we have in some special way dishonored him? My true informant, my burdened conscience, gives me at once the one answer to each of these antagonist questions. It pronounces without any misgiving that God exists, and it pronounces quite as surely that I am alienated from him. It is